Hi, I'm George Mueller, and this is intended to be an introduction to Chapter 4 in the textbook for my History 101 class. This section goes over Alexander the Great and the spread of Greek culture. Alexander the Great is one of the most famous people in history for a good reason. He conquered a massive amount of territory and founded an extremely short-lived political empire, but a cultural empire that lasted much longer. Now, Alexander didn't start off with nothing. His father, Philip of Macedon, was the king of Macedonia. And Macedonia is this area immediately to the north of Greece. The Macedonians were a unique group in Greek life. They considered themselves Greeks, but the rest of the Greeks did not consider them Greek. Macedonia is much more open territory than Greece proper, and the farms were much larger, and therefore you had a rich group and a number of poor peasants working the land, and not really anybody in between. So you have rich and poor, kings and nobles, not the kind of strong middle class that the rest of Greece has. Now, Philip became involved politically in northern Greece. And instead of conquering the different city-states one by one, which would have been possible because Macedonia was larger than any individual city-state and had a measurably larger army than any, instead what he did was carefully ally with city-state after city-state and conquer one after another city. And he had his army in strategic points throughout Greece. Also, Philip realized something about the Greeks. After the defeat of the Persians, the Greeks had become incredibly self-confident and, frankly, cultural chauvinists. Their army had beaten a much larger army and proven to be the best army in the world. Why make changes? Well, because somebody might come along with a better idea. And that somebody wound up being Philip. Philip's idea was to use a professional army that served for a longer time and could train a lot more. The Greeks did train generally most of their adult life and were, compared to other armies, well trained. Philip's army was really well trained indeed. So much so that they could use longer spears, 12 to 15 foot long pikes, giving them a much longer range. And the ability to have more people put their spears out in front of the front line. And that meant when you attacked one of these formations, there's a line of spear points. Now, the downside to these long spears is you're going to move more slowly. And moving this square formation is a lot harder. It takes constant training and constant practice. This isn't something that you can get together a couple times a year and know how to do well enough. If one person in the middle trips, you're all in trouble. Recognizing that this formation was slow moving, he also developed lighter troops who worked in an open formation and screened the edges of these formations. So you had this mix of light infantry and very heavy infantry. Also, the Greeks had never really worked on siege operations. Generally, if an army got to a city and got behind that city's walls, the Greeks kind of gave up and left. Alexander applied Greek scientific thought to getting through walls, and that will have telling effect. Alexander took the throne when his father was murdered. Now, it's entirely possible that Alexander had put the murderer up to it, but we'll never know because Alexander immediately killed him. Many people in Macedonia believe that Alexander was the murderer, and that's faintly and horribly possible. That was common in noble life in Macedonia. So, Now, Alexander faces some problems. Number one is the Greeks don't really trust him or respect him. He was very young, and While his father had been respected, he wasn't. So he needed to act fast and come up with something to tie all the Greeks together. That thing is going to be convenient. That's the Persians. Nothing ties a civilization together like a good enemy. And it's even better if your enemy is corrupt, untrustworthy, and a little incompetent. And that he got all of those things in Darius III. Darius was a usurper. He'd taken the crown in Persia by poisoning the previous emperor. So he doesn't have a great reputation. And because the Persians had been defeated by the Greeks, the whole empire is lacking military reputation. And that means that there's a threat of revolt from throughout the Persian Empire, because every provincial governor knows, well, just with a drink in the right place, a little poisoning, or maybe an arrow or a dagger in the hand of an assassin, and he could be emperor. So Darius has to watch his own side at least as much as he does anyone he fights. Plus, Darius is no military man. He's not a military genius. And we're going to see this again and again. Alexander will defeat the Persian Empire in just a few years. Pardon me. He'll march into as far as India. He won't even capture Darius. Darius is actually killed by one of his own men. No one was too surprised. And Alexander found himself in control of the Persian Empire. Now, there's a lot of details about this, and I really do recommend giving a read through the textbook. Okay, I require you to read the textbook. But give it a read through. It's one of the really interesting stories of history, partly because our sources on it conflict and are a little bit, they're told like legends. So they're not entirely trustworthy. Well, whatever the case, after Alexander conquers the Persians, he's left with this very strange situation. Little tiny Greece, over here, even including Macedonia, has now conquered an empire that's many times its own size, both in space and population, and possibly 100 times wealthier. Well, that leaves Alexander with a real problem. How do you run the Persian Empire? Do you force them to become Greek? And like many emperors in the past, especially military emperors, Alexander chooses integration. He adopts Persian dress. He rules from Persia. He makes many of his men take Persian wives. He takes Persian wives himself. And he settles down to act as a Persian emperor. It doesn't go great. Alexander develops, by all accounts, significant drinking problems, augmented by a significant drug problem. Opium was widely available in Persia and not in Greece, and Alexander was not a man to turn down any vice. So Alexander quickly becomes a drunk. He kills some of his own relatives in drunken rages and wakes up the next morning not remembering. And eventually, he dies. Still a young man, but he dies, and it's never entirely clear if he was poisoned or poisoned himself with alcohol. Either way, he leaves behind no clear path for his empire to continue on without him. It was based purely on his force of personality. And so it breaks up. The Mesopotamian area will become the Seleucid Empire, taken by one of his generals. Egypt, the Ptolemaic Empire. Macedonia, the Antigonid. And Western Asia Minor, I'll show you where that is on a map in just a sec, will become the Kingdom of Pergamum. I mention it because it'll show up and have a very unique history under the Romans. Another thing that happens shortly after Alexander dies is that a new threat looms over the Hellenistic world. And by Hellenistic, that's the newly Greek world. And that's the Celts. The Celts are an ethnic group who had inhabited Europe, especially Western and Southern Europe, France, in as early as the Middle Iron Age. The Celts had a distinctive culture. Here's an example of a recreation. And they're an ethnic group who are going to be related to most modern Europeans. Just looking at this shield, I thought it was fun because it's practically the emblem for the coffee hound in downtown Bloomington. Just thought that was fun. But the Celts are important because they're going to be a threat to the Greeks and later to the Romans. So here's Pergamum. Down here's Egypt, massively wealthy because of its great production of grain. The Seleucid Empire, budding up to India, is rich because of trade. Macedonia is going to be important politically. And Pergamum is going to be important because it's a place for other people to attack. Another thing that needs to be mentioned is some developments in philosophy and religion immediately after Alexander's death. Two of these movements are going to be based around how to find true happiness. The Stoics, which is going to be a philosophy that can be associated with other religions, both Greco-Roman religions and later with Catholicism, and to an extent with Islam. It's founded by a man named Zeno, and the Stoics say the way you find true happiness is by finding harmony with the will of the gods. That is, find harmony with nature, and whatever happens to you, however bad it is, realize it's the will of the gods, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's a little bit passive. Now, Stoics do go on to be involved in a lot of things. This Stoic tendency allows people to kind of roll with bad things that happen to them, and Stoics are often very involved in politics. On the other hand, the Epicureans are going to pursue pleasure in a very different way. Now, the Epicureans, like the Stoics, aren't looking for the fast, let's drink a lot, eat a lot, and die young kind of pleasure. They're looking for long-term pleasure that is good for you. The Epicureans believe that withdrawing from politics will let you have more peace of mind and give you a more pleasurable life. So they tend to withdraw from politics and focus on achieving their goals in a kind of smaller setting. Now, one of the interesting things about the Epicureans is they're not atheists, but they didn't believe the gods were widely involved in the world day to day. Instead, they believed the world ran on through mechanizations that could be understood in time. And they had a theory that all matter in the world is composed of what they called atoms, and that atoms can move in any direction. And the way atoms are put together give different materials their basic nature. That's very modern. The last thing to mention are mystery religions. These are small religions, and there's a huge number of them that develop around the Greco and Roman world. All of these religions are based around people gaining a personal relationship with a god or gods, and having a mystery revealed to them. There's always something not really rational about it. So this gives you a little idea of what the Hellenistic world is like. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and I'll see you next intro.